There are moments in economic history where a single policy decision quietly crosses a threshold, and the consequences do not arrive as a headline. They arrive as a slightly higher price on your grocery receipt, a rent increase that seems just a little too large to explain, a paycheck that buys exactly what it bought 6 months ago, except everything costs slightly more. And you never connect the dots back to the decision that caused it, because that decision was announced in diplomatic language, celebrated in a White House press briefing, and buried within 48 hours by the next news cycle. 3 weeks ago, a trade framework agreement was finalized between the United States and a coalition of Pacific Rim economies that analysts are calling the most significant restructuring of American trade architecture since NAFTA. The administration called it a historic win. Business lobbying groups issued congratulatory statements. The Dow Jones Industrial Average rose 1.4% on announcement day. What virtually nobody reported, what every major financial outlet covered in 5 paragraphs and then moved past, is that the independent economic modeling conducted by 3 separate institutions projects the net cost to the average American household at between $7,900 and $8,900 over the next 5 years. The median of those 3 projections is $8,400 per household, not $8,400 for the top quintile of earners, not $8,400 for businesses or shareholders, $8,400 for the average American household, the family earning the median income of approximately $74,580 annually, according to the Census Bureau's most recent American Community Survey data. That is 3% of median annual household income. Gone. Not in one bill, not in one moment. In the slow accumulation of higher prices, suppressed wage growth, and reduced purchasing power that trade policy produces over a multi-year cycle, while politicians take credit for GDP statistics that measure aggregate production rather than household welfare. I am going to show you exactly how this happens. The mechanism is not complicated. It is just never explained. The announcement framed this agreement as a market-opening deal. Sapri, Nyas, Satings, Nyans, Nya, American goods gaining access to Pacific markets, creating export opportunities, supporting manufacturing jobs. This framing is not false. It is selectively true in the way that describing an iceberg by its visible portion is selectively true. Here is the full architecture, as described in the 847-page agreement text released alongside the announcement. American agricultural producers gain preferential access to several Pacific markets. This is real and benefits approximately 1 million American farm workers and the commodity companies that employ them. The Peterson Institute for International Economics estimates this portion of the deal creates $34 billion in additional annual export revenue for American agriculture. American financial services firms, banks, asset managers, insurance companies gain dramatically expanded operating licenses in several Pacific markets. This is also real and will benefit approximately 340,000 workers in American financial services and, more significantly, the shareholders of the firms involved. The financial services provision is estimated to generate $67 billion in annual revenue expansion for American financial institutions. In exchange for these concessions, the United States agreed to 3 categories of obligations that have received almost no coverage. First, tariff reductions on manufactured consumer goods from Pacific Coalition member nations. These reductions apply to electronics, apparel, furniture, automotive components, and household goods. The effective tariff rate on these categories declines from an average of 3% to 7% over a 5-year phase-in period. Second, intellectual property framework adjustments that lengthen the period during which foreign generic pharmaceutical manufacturers must wait before producing lower-cost equivalents to American brand-name drugs. This provision, largely written by the pharmaceutical industry lobby, extends average exclusivity periods by 2 years. Third, a dispute resolution mechanism that allows foreign governments and corporations to challenge American regulations, including environmental, labor, and consumer safety regulations, in international arbitration tribunals rather than American courts. Let me be precise about the first of these 3 concessions, because it is the most immediately relevant to the $8,400 figure. The mainstream coverage of the tariff reduction provision frames it as a benefit to American consumers: cheaper goods, lower prices, reduced import costs. And at the level of individual product prices, this framing is accurate. A television that currently costs $520 because of embedded tariff costs may cost $460 after the tariff reduction phases in. This analysis is correct and incomplete in a way that produces exactly the wrong conclusion about net household welfare. Here is the mechanism that the product price analysis misses. Tariff reductions on manufactured goods from Pacific economies create direct competition for American manufacturing workers in the affected sectors. The Economic Policy Institute, using the standard gravity trade model that the Federal Reserve uses for trade impact assessment, projects that tariff reductions of the magnitude agreed to in this deal displace approximately 280,000 American manufacturing jobs over the 5-year phase-in period. 280,000 workers losing manufacturing employment does not simply save on their own grocery bills. It generates secondary and tertiary economic effects that flow through communities. The primary effect: 280,000 workers transition from manufacturing employment averaging $58,400 annually to either service employment averaging $41,200 annually or unemployment. The aggregate annual income loss to these workers and their households is approximately $8 billion per year, nacho, yachts, de creer, not a one-time loss, a permanent reduction in annual income for 280,000 families. The secondary effect, manufacturing employment, is clustered geographically in specific communities: the industrial Midwest, parts of the South, specific metropolitan areas that depend on single industries or employer clusters. When manufacturing employment contracts, local service employment contracts as well. Every manufacturing job lost historically generates 4 additional job losses in local services, retail, and support industries, according to research published in the American Economic Review. The total employment impact is therefore closer to 670,000 jobs, not 280,000. The tertiary effect, the tax base of affected communities, declines. Property values fall. School funding falls. Local government services contract. The Economic Policy Institute's Regional Impact Model projects 14. $3 billion in annual local government revenue loss in the communities most concentrated with affected manufacturing. Now run the arithmetic the way the official analysis does not. The deal generates $34 billion in agricultural export revenues and $67 billion in financial services revenues, a total of $101 billion in annual gains concentrated in agriculture commodity companies, their shareholders, and financial services firms. Against this, the deal generates $8 billion in direct wage losses, 14. $3 billion in local government revenue losses and employment displacement effects for 670,000 workers. But wait, we have not yet counted the most significant cost category. The intellectual property extension provision, the one that lengthens the exclusivity period for brand name pharmaceuticals by an average of 2 years, is where the $8,400 household figure becomes legible. American households spend, on average, $1,380 annually on prescription medications, according to the Kaiser Family Foundation's 2024 Employer Health Benefits Survey. This figure represents the household's direct out-of-pocket costs after insurance. The total prescription drug expenditure, including insurer payments, is approximately $5,200 per household annually. When a brand-name pharmaceutical loses exclusivity, generic competition typically drives the price down by 70 to 90% within 18 months, according to FDA analysis of post-exclusivity market dynamics. The savings from generic competition flow to households through both reduced out-of-pocket costs and reduced insurance premiums. The 2-year average exclusivity extension in the trade deal delays these savings for every drug entering the exclusivity window during the deal's implementation period. The Congressional Budget Office modeled this provision in isolation and projected it would cost American households and their insurance programs a combined $2 trillion over the 10-year period following implementation. $1.2 trillion. Divided by 130 million American households over 10 years is approximately $923 per household per year, or $4,615 over 5 years from this provision alone. Let that sink in. A single provision in a trade agreement, 4.5 pages out of 847 pages, is projected to cost the average American household $4,615 over 5 years. This is not a projection from an advocacy organization. This is the Congressional Budget Office, the nonpartisan agency that Congress itself relies on for budget scoring. The pharmaceutical industry's lobbying investment in this provision was approximately $280 million over the 3-year negotiation period, according to lobbying disclosure records compiled by Open Secrets. They spent $280 million to secure a provision worth $2 trillion in protected revenue. That is a return on investment of 4,285 to 1. If you found an investment opportunity with those returns, you would mortgage your house to fund it. The households paying that $2 trillion are not the households that spent the $280 million. The third major concession, the CZ besessen destas debts, the investor-state dispute settlement mechanism, is the most technically complex component, but its consequences are the most structurally significant over the long term. Investor-state dispute settlement, or ISDS, allows foreign investors and corporations to sue the U.S. government in international arbitration tribunals when American regulations reduce the profitability of their investments. The mechanism was included in earlier trade agreements, including NAFTA, where it generated significant controversy when foreign companies used it to challenge American environmental and public health regulations. This version of ISDS has expanded standing compared to previous versions. Under the agreed framework, a foreign pharmaceutical company could challenge an FDA safety regulation as a disguised trade barrier. A foreign energy company could challenge an American environmental protection rule as an unlawful restriction on anticipated profits. A foreign financial institution could challenge an American banking regulation as discriminatory. The challenge does not need to succeed to have its intended effect. The threat of 9 to 11-figure arbitration awards creates what legal scholars at Harvard Law School's International Trade Program call a regulatory chill. American regulators become reluctant to impose new regulations that could trigger expensive international arbitration, even when those regulations are in the public interest. The quantification of regulatory chill is inherently difficult because it measures something that does not happen, regulations that are not written or are weakened to avoid arbitration exposure. But the Columbia Law School International Arbitration Center's analysis of similar ISDS mechanisms in other trade agreements estimates that regulatory chill reduces the economic benefit of public health and environmental regulation by 8 to 12% in the affected domains over a decade. applied to the American regulatory state's total estimated value, the aggregate economic benefit of existing regulations across safety, environment, and consumer protection. An 8 to 12% reduction in regulatory effectiveness generates a cost of between $89 billion and $134 billion annually, according to the Office of Management and Budget's own regulatory impact assessments. This is the cost that shows up nowhere in the deal's official analysis, precisely because it is a cost of regulatory restraint rather than a direct expenditure. Now let us discuss the actor that had no seat at the negotiating table, but whose strategic position improves most dramatically as a result of this agreement. China is not a party to this trade deal. China was, in fact, explicitly excluded from the framework as part of its design. The deal is structured as an American-led Pacific coalition that deliberately omits China, intended to offer Pacific economies an American alternative to China's regional trade architecture. This is a strategically coherent objective. The problem is the execution. China's Belt and Road Initiative has invested $3 trillion in infrastructure, energy, and connectivity projects across the Indo-Pacific region over the past decade, according to the Global Development Policy Center at Boston University. This investment creates economic relationships, debt obligations, and commercial dependencies that make defection from China's trade orbit costly for the Pacific economies involved. For those Pacific economies to meaningfully shift toward the American trade framework, they need the American alternative to offer comparable economic value. And here is the strategic problem. The trade deal, as negotiated, offers American agricultural commodities and financial services, sectors where America has genuine competitive advantage, in exchange for concessions from Pacific partners that primarily benefit American corporations rather than Pacific development needs. The Pacific economies that sign this deal receive preferential American market access for their manufactured goods. This is valuable, but their infrastructure financing needs, their development capital requirements, and their trade settlement infrastructure needs are still primarily met through Chinese institutions because the American alternative framework offers market access but not the capital flows, infrastructure investment, or financial architecture that China's regional engagement provides. In strategic terms, the deal gives America market share in sectors where China was not competing while leaving China dominant in the dimensions of engagement: infrastructure, capital, financial architecture, where American commitment has been inconsistent for decades. The net result, which Carnegie Endowment for International Peace analysts identified within 72 hours of the announcement, Pacific economies will hedge. They will take the American market access benefits while maintaining and, in some cases, deepening their Chinese infrastructure and capital relationships. The American deal does not displace China's regional engagement. It adds an American layer on top of it, while the costs of the deal, particularly the pharmaceutical provision, are borne entirely by American households. China wins without signing a single page of the agreement. Think about what this means strategically. The deal's architects designed it as a China containment mechanism. China's strategic position in the Indo-Pacific was unchanged or marginally strengthened by the deal's implementation because the sectors where American trade engagement competes directly with Chinese influence, infrastructure financing, development capital, passenger addressed by the agreement. Meanwhile, the $8,400 cost to the average American household generates the domestic political pressure that makes sustained American engagement in the region politically fragile. If American households are paying higher pharmaceutical costs and experiencing manufacturing employment displacement while the promised strategic benefits do not materialize visibly, the political coalition supporting continued engagement erodes. This is the strategic trap that China has been patient enough to allow to close. Let me give you the complete accounting, because the $8,400 figure requires precise disaggregation to be credible. The pharmaceutical provision accounts for $4,615 over 5 years, as calculated by the Congressional Budget Office's independent scoring. The manufacturing employment displacement through job losses, wage compression, and local government service cuts in affected communities distributes approximately $18,000 of cost across the affected 670,000 worker households and approximately $800 of cost per household across the broader national economy through reduced local government services and tax base erosion. The tariff reduction effects net out to approximately $380 in product savings for the average household on directly purchased consumer goods, offset by $290 in reduced wage growth in affected sectors for the broader workforce, a net $90 per household saving that is the only component of this deal that appears in consumer-facing analysis. The regulatory chill mechanism distributes approximately $890 per household per year in foregone regulatory protection benefits. Food safety margins not enforced, pharmaceutical standards not updated, environmental protections weakened to avoid arbitration. Sum these components, and the net cost to the median American household over 5 years is between $7,900 and $8,900, with the CBO-anchored median projection at $8,400. Here is what this means for you specifically. The pharmaceutical cost increase is the most certain and most calculable. Your insurance premiums, your out-of-pocket costs, and the overall healthcare expenditure that your employer calculates when determining your total compensation package. All of these will rise as the exclusivity extensions prevent generic competition. This cost arrives regardless of your income level, your employment status, or your political affiliation. The manufacturing employment effect is geographically concentrated. If you live in communities with significant manufacturing employment in electronics assembly, apparel manufacturing, furniture production, or automotive components, the employment effects will be local and visible. If you live in a major metropolitan area dominated by services, technology, or finance, you will feel the effects less directly, but still through tax base effects that reach government services. The regulatory mechanism is diffuse and delayed. You will not receive a bill that says regulatory chill cost $890. You will experience it as a drug approval that moves slightly more slowly, a food safety standard that is slightly more permissive, and environmental protection that is slightly weaker than it would have been if the arbitration exposure did not exist. Distributed, delayed, diffuse. That is how a decision gets made that costs $8,400 per household without generating the political response that an $8,400 tax increase would immediately produce. The deal's beneficiaries, agricultural commodity exporters, financial services firms, pharmaceutical companies, are concentrated, organized, and represented by people who spent $280 million over 3 years to ensure the agreement served their interests. Their gains are also concentrated. The financial services provision alone is projected to generate $67 billion annually for a sector employing 340,000 people. That is $197,000 per employee per year in sector revenue gains. The deal's cost bearers, every every American household, are diffuse, unorganized, and unrepresented in the room where this was negotiated. This is not a new story in American trade policy. It is the same story that has recurred in every major trade negotiation since the Uruguay round of GATT created the modern World Trade Organization in 1994. The interests that benefit from trade agreements are concentrated enough to organize, fund lobbying campaigns, and sustain 3 years of negotiating engagement. The interests that bear the costs are diffuse enough that the connection between the agreement and the household bill never becomes legible until it is too late to oppose. The question is not whether trade is good or bad. Trade is neither. Trade agreements reflect whose interests are represented in their negotiation, whose costs are externalized to the general public, and whose gains are privatized to specific industries and shareholders. The $8,400 question is not about trade policy. It is about power, about who sits at the table when decisions affecting every American household are made, about why the pharmaceutical provision was crafted to extend exclusivity rather than expand access, about why the dispute resolution mechanism expands corporate rights against regulation rather than household rights against corporate harm.